Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Weekly Review. I'm your host, Paul Hazard, and joining me this morning is Lucy Newberger, John Gibbs, and Brent Poland. You're all very welcome.
Morning to you.
Morning.
Now, Lucy and Hannah had a great show during the week. It was all about teacher side hustles. Fantastic stuff. Great. And they asked the question, would you appear on reality TV? Well, I unfortunately need to make a statement now because the vicious rumors running around that I am going to appear on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here are absolutely untrue. I really have to emphasize how untrue they are. It's Love Island. Get it right, people. Let's get to it after these messages from our sponsors.
Right, we have to...
Oh, we're reading them out today, okay?
I'm afraid.
Okay. Our show sponsor today is John Catt Education. And if you visit johncattbookshop.com and you use the code JCTTR2425, they'll give you 20% off your order, which Brent and I worked out the other day is 1/5.
Sounds better, 1/5, doesn't it?
Definitely sounds a lot better. Anyway, on to our first story this morning. And it's a sad story. It's about a teacher who faced discrimination. And although she came through and, succeeded in her case, talks about feeling worthless, questioning herself about returning to the classroom. Following an unannounced 25-minute lesson observation, there were all kinds of accusations and so on made. The NFER, which is the National Foundation for Educational Research, then says people from ethnic minority backgrounds are vastly underrepresented in the teaching workforce, particularly at senior leadership levels. John, schools are places of, respect, empathy, tolerance, where individuals are very much prized. It doesn't matter if they're pupils, classroom assistants, teachers, people are prized. How does discrimination behavior happen in a school in the 21st century?
Well, you paint a very idealistic picture there of schools. They are part of society. I'd like to think that. When I first went into teaching, we will talk later about the desire to be something. When you realize you're a teacher, that sense of that's different to other jobs. Yes, we want them to places of tolerance and all those things, but that would mean in our society that teaching was very different from the police, the courts, the army, the legal profession, and every other major institution of this country. That clearly racism of this kind exists and exists in the wider society. I doubt teachers are different. Unfortunately, in teaching, increasingly in my career, what I saw was bullying of a wider kind was more and more prevalent, from management towards people that didn't fit in and didn't like and so on. Alas, we reflect what we get in society. We reflect the kind of society that the schools are in, that schools exist in. And so I think, yes, I'm not at all surprised by this. It's something that all of us need to address in all sorts of professions. But beyond that, the way this teacher was bullied was to put them on a support plan, a kind of Orwellian back to front piece of nonsense where teachers are pushed out of the profession, people who were active in the unions, people who raise awkward questions in meetings, people who just don't fit in for whatever malign reason are often pushed out by unannounced visits, unexpected inspections, that your books need somehow, there's some unnamed problem with you that requires lots of management attention, that when you can take it no more, you sign a non-disclosure order and get out. And I'm afraid it's become an epidemic in teaching. It's too commonplace. I know I know teachers that are still in the profession. I'm retired, but still in the profession where this is commonplace, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's very sad. Yeah. There's a significant personal toll, and this teacher described the personal toll. Um, After a tribunal, there's something of, the death of a teacher's soul, I always think. Lucy, what is the personal cost to an individual? And is it possible to return to the classroom after something like this?
I mean, I know of cases where teachers have returned, but they are not the same person they were previously. I think to go through something like that is, and I'm always reticent to use the word traumatic, but I think it would be to have your career hauled across the coals like that in front of your peers, in front of whoever sits on these tribunals. I mean, I don't even know, because I'm fortunate enough to have never experienced that, but it's humiliating, and it's something that I think would be very difficult to recover from. And I mean, if it was me, I don't think I could go back. So I think the personal cost is enormous. And if you are going to put a teacher through that, you need to be damn sure that there is, reason enough to be doing something like that. Because, we've seen in recent times, when we talk about Ofsted and things like that, how wrong these things can go, and the real, hardcore impact these can have. You only have to look at what has happened. What has happened in recent times, with teachers sadly ending their own lives, or head teachers sadly ending their own lives. We're easy pickings, whether it's internally or externally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that?
Absolutely, John.
I think teachers are often their own worst enemies, because we do all sort of suspect that there's a sort of imposter syndrome, that that we'll be caught out in a sense, that we're not doing it as well as we should. I don't know. I wake every summer holiday, I get towards the end, I think, I can't do this. What am I even thinking of? So I think we are vulnerable and fragile, oddly.
Sunday night scaries, as they call them. A lot of teachers are affected by that. Yes, yeah. Brent, there is definitely an underrepresentation of Black and Asian teachers, and as you move up the the management structure, there are fewer and fewer Black and Asian managers. We work with children all day, every day. Are they affected by not seeing, representatives from their society and so on in senior positions?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, updating the curriculum to reflect the learners. And as an historian, I'm doing a lot of that when I look at the construction of my classroom, even in an area of the Midlands, which is predominantly white. There is now more ethnicity, there's now more diversity, there's now more multiculturalism. And I'm not buying into the fact multiculturalism has failed in this country. Quite the opposite. I think it's one of the success stories, is that over generations and thousands of years, basically this country's culture has been created by assimilation of different cultures, even the language itself. But the problem is that there's a glass ceiling. There's subtle racism is more subtle these days. It's more nuanced. It's more in the passing over for promotions. It's more of the the person just gets forced out. And I think it's what's happened to education in the last generation has allowed for those gaps, that the not what you know, the who you know, the CEOs who aren't even in education. I think the semi-privatization of our education system has allowed a lot of these things to happen in a vacuum, whereas before there was accountability, the local authority, there was a set standard. I think now there's a lot of little cliques and jobs for the boys, and kind of not what you know and who you know, and those networks, people who are in the minority groups are the outsiders, and it's very hard when you're the outsider to get work your way into the inside. And speaking as somebody who considers themselves to be an ethnic minority, I was reminded recently that I had to work really, really hard against the backdrop of what I can only describe as anti-Irish sentiment, which I used to get, and I still get. I had a parent who recently claimed that their child couldn't understand me because they couldn't understand my accent. And I looked at the surname, and 2 generations ago, they have an Irish surname. I'm like, what are you on about? I'm sorry the way I speak, then, but what do you want me to speak like the Midlands? And there is that subtle hint of it. But we reflect society, and society's become a nastier, more horrible place about this, where we used to have people who would hide their overt racism, almost now just saying, well, that's the way I think. I'm entitled to my opinion. I'm going to offend somebody. I'm going to offend somebody. So there's something else happening out there that I think is really scaring me. And that is the sort of rise of this mentality fueled by social media, which I think many of our colleagues from ethnic minorities are afraid to speak out and speak up because they aren't getting the support. And I'm going to say it. I mean, join a union, please, please, please join a union, call it out. My last point is, and it goes to the learners. If this is what's happening to the teaching staff and people say, well, how do we stop racism in society? How can we model good behavior in our profession when this goes on in our profession? When we're telling the kids, please don't racially abuse each other, please don't do this. How can we hold our heads up high and say that we model good behavior when in our own profession this goes on? And yet we turn around and say, oh my gosh, these kids these days. We got to sort our own house out first before we start lecturing the children. So anybody in the teaching profession now who harbors any of those whatsoever, get out of my profession, leave my profession and stop it. I say the same thing I said last week, same as bullying. All forms of racism, hatred, and bullying should never be in school or in a classroom. And if there's any teacher that is, call them out, get them out of our profession. They don't deserve. I'd say the same to the Met Office. The Met Police. I'd say to any large institution, get these people out of these professions. They don't deserve our profession, and they don't deserve to be anywhere near children. Full stop. That's all I have to say on that.
Just to finish on this topic, a very quick gut reaction. Yesterday, Kimmy Badenoch was elected the leader of the Conservative Party. She will be on our TV screens most days, every day. Will the fact that she's a black woman in a very prominent position, will that make a difference, do you think, John?
Yes, it's a good thing. Who knew? The Conservative Party have that surprising ability to have the first woman MP, the first woman Prime Minister, first Asian Prime, and so on. And it's good, as Brent says. We live in an increasingly multiculturalism hasn't failed. This is an example of something good. I probably disagree with everything she's going to say over the next few years, but this is symbolically good.
But also testament to the character, the person, and the intelligence that you have. You can disagree with what she says, but you can accept her as a person and the position that she's in. Lucy, is it a good thing that Kimmy Badenoch is a woman of colour and will be on our TV screens every day?
Yes, I mean, yes, but much echoing kind of John's sentiment. Whether I agree or disagree with her is kind of irrelevant, really, for now. But having her visible, I think, is hugely important.
Brent, is it a good thing Kimmy will be highly visible?
Yeah, absolutely. It was the same as Rishi Sunak's last speech. I think before the budget, there was a really good back and forward in Parliament where he stood up and Rishi Sunak said it was really good about being the first Asian Prime Minister. It wasn't a big thing. So in many ways, it's not a big thing that Kimmy Badenoch is a woman of colour. It shows you look at the previous cabinet. My issue with people like Kimmy Badenoch is when they don't actually sort of look at the compassion and the empathy they should show. I would echo Margaret Thatcher. People turn around and said, Margaret Thatcher was the first woman Prime Minister. You know what? She didn't promote a single woman when she was a Prime Minister. Yes, she was a cabinet full of men. Her philosophy was, if I can do it, all those other girls around there can do it. So you got to be very careful of holding up those people and saying, that will be really good for my community. Yes, it will be, in the sense that as long as those individuals show, I think, the values and compassion of the wider community. And sometimes they don't, and that can be quite upsetting. But no, congratulations to her. Well played. I just hope that she softens some of her language as well and some of her policies, which I think are very divisionary. But maybe that's what she was playing to the gallery to get elected, I hope. But there was a good comment there, Paul, that came up, and I thought I'd mark on that comment, which is true. One of the things I've tried to do is retain my identity in teaching, and it is really tough sometimes when you are forced to possibly assimilate and not be who you are. I've tried as much as possible to retain my Irish identity, but it is sometimes really difficult, and that's a very good comment, because there is pressure just to fit in, keep your head down, hide, and just this is the way things are done here. And sometimes when you're the new arrival and you're saying, no, why can't things be different? You can just be sometimes subtly just sidelined or mocked, derided, or even just people think it's banter sometimes. But the amount of times I've had to call out people when they said things to me, because I think one of my colleagues, but 20 years ago says, well, you like Ireland so much, why did you go back there? And I looked, what? Are you joking? Of which they got a whole rant of, well, one of the reasons I'm here because I liked Ireland so much, but we didn't ruin it. So don't you start that carry on with me. And then it was literally a kind of
Yeah.
No, I would straight into the head teacher and says, if I ever hear that again, I'll be having serious issues with that.
I can't imagine, Brent, someone saying that to you. Actually, I mean, did they know you? Had they ever met you before? I would never venture such a thought in your direction.
But it has cost me. I would go so far as to say sometimes because I'm seen as a troublemaker, or I'm seen as I'm not getting, and it's that fine line you walk between being your true self, same as in the classroom, when somebody's putting pressure on you to teach a certain way, and you're going, you know what, I'm not doing that because that's not my true teaching style. And I think along with this,
another story. I'm very interested to see your thoughts on one of our later stories.
This is a lot of pressure put on teachers to conform. And then we have to make the children conform. And I don't think sometimes it leaves a lot of room for individuality or identity, especially in the last couple of years. So that's a really good point.
Yes. Super point. There, we will have to leave that story for now and move on to our next story. And that is about... So this week, there was another story out. What are the rules around teachers attending protests? Now, as teachers, really, as has been pointed out in our previous story there, we're always self-aware. We are aware of particularly things like inculcation, promulgation, proselytizing, all big words that simply mean we are people of influence, and we need to be careful not to abuse our influence in any way. We are in society, we definitely are held to higher standards in terms of tolerance, respect, even in our own communities. We are held to higher standard, and people talk about so-and-so, the teacher that lives up the road, and you're maybe consulted. Nonetheless, we are fully fledged citizens, we have rights, and we are allowed to disagree with certain things, and particularly governmental things that might require protest and might require you to go along to a march or a meeting or whatever. But there are risks. Brent, what are the risks for teachers protesting?
Well, how long you got? I mean, as a
we
person,
don't have long, by the way.
Well, I've started and led campaign groups on many issues, from environment to anti-war. I was in the anti-war protest. That was one of my first years as a teacher. I was down in London, we're holding a placard up saying, don't have the war in Iraq. Completely vindicated on that one. In fact, I was born protesting. My parents were civil rights marchers back in the 60s and 70s. So it was put into me, but also was the idea of is that things can change. And that's the connection, is I protest because I believe that the world can change through peaceful protest. In the same way that I believe that as a teacher, we educate people and they can change the world as well. So it's a little bit of both. The risk, of course, is that you stick your neck out. As I was saying earlier on, if you stick your neck out too much, then you run the risk of criticism. And especially in the world we live in now, where people are out to get you. People are out to pigeonhole you, out to get you, out to record you. And on some of the issues that are, wedge issues like trans issues, stuff like that, we've seen news story after news story where a teacher expresses an opinion, and then that's it. It makes the national press, and then there's a protest. And again, I would say these rules for protesting, make sure that what you're protesting about is something that you'd want parents to sort of, you've got to stand in front of the classroom and have your reputation where children have to believe that you're a respectable individual. So protest has to be peaceful. And equally, if you get yourself arrested and things like that, you run the risk of your professionality is called into question. So there's a fine line between peaceful protest and also the type of protests you're engaging in and the activities of those protests. So say, for instance, as an environmentalist, I can't go anywhere near somewhere like Extinction Rebellion. As much as I agree with their principles, I cannot and would not protest with them. because they are, breaking the law, and therefore that would call into question my integrity. So there is we can go far enough as teachers, but we just have to be mindful of our responsibilities and also the credibility issue that we have in society.
And that's the dilemma, really, isn't it? Yeah. John, it makes me wonder then, is it right, that as teachers, we are held to higher standards, of behavior, discretion, accountability, tolerance, respect? Is it right that we're held to those higher standards against other professions?
Yes, I mean, when I first went into teaching, I maybe only teaching for a month or two, and someone came up to me and asked me to sign or endorse their passport as a witness, and I thought, oh yes, I'm that category of person. I'm an esteemed member of the community. I thought and I was actually all the way through. Whenever that happened, I was pleased to do it, in a sense that it affirmed that belief in myself as that. And we do have a responsibility. Brent's right. It's different from other jobs, and I'd like to think we promote that. I'm wary of ideas like British values and holding up value, because I don't want other people to define what those values are and use them against me. Other than that, I'm happy to feel that I am a role model, was a role model, and that I have an extra responsibility in that. Yes.
Well, once a teacher, always a teacher, and I think you remain a role model, very definitely.
Thank you.
Lucy, given what Brent and John have said there then, and the story that we're talking about, how can teachers express their views responsibly?
This is so difficult, because we are told, and it's in the teacher standards, it's everywhere. We have to kind of at least appear apolitical, a-religious, but we are human too. And I think we have to be extra mindful in that if we are going to go there and we are going to share some of, what we believe. And I think, I do still think there has to be a bit of sort of, if you want to call it church and state in terms of that, then fine, I couldn't think of a better term. I think you also have to be willing to look at the other side. You have to be willing to, if you're going to open up those discussions with your students, you also kind of have to almost not be taking the lead in those conversations. You need to be there to facilitate and allow them to kind of happen, but also to ensure that, it's not kind of going too different, sort of one way or the other, too much of a sort of extreme direction. I think we can do this, but I think you have to be careful. And if you are seen to be bringing the profession into disrepute in any way, then that should absolutely have consequences. But I also don't think teachers should be obligated to share this side of themselves either, and that's where it becomes tricky. If they kind of want to keep it separate, they can, but they also have to know that if someone does spot you, that you may have to account for that regardless of what it is you are being seen at.
Yeah. And teaching, of course, is not a neutral activity at all. There are values and so on involved. Just mindful of what JBL says, never apologize for protesting. And yes, we would agree with him, as long as, of course, and he adds it himself, it's peaceful protest gives a voice to us all, he says. Anyway, on to our third story for today. Now, another difficult and challenging concerning story emerged this week. Pupils left humiliated by school's lanyard rules. So pupils at one school I don't think they were asked. I think they were told that they had to wear lanyards that detailed their learning disabilities. What a horrific word, but I'm quoting that word, disabilities. I'm not using that. That's a quotation. I also have a bugbear about lanyards. I know some people love lanyards because it's just like a symbol of power. I actually detest them. I think they're horrible. And they always clashed with my ties as well. But this is done, and again, I'm quoting here, in the name of encouraging tolerance and helping students with differences to feel a sense of belonging and identity. Now, Lucy, to me, this is intolerable. It's appalling in every regard. How does a school come to the conclusion that this is in any way helpful, educational, even humane? How does a school come to that conclusion that we'll pin these lanyards on these children? And
I mean, it's bizarre to me. I think I said to you before we came on air, I would love to have been a fly on the wall rather, in that meeting. I'd love to know who was there and who went, do you know what? This is a great way to promote inclusion, to integrate students. If you're labeling them, it's just, you might, I mean, it's sort of, hey, I am a sore thumb. It's doing the exact opposite. It's not encouraging sort of, because I think there are a lot of students, and I can't speak for all of them, of course, but who do desperately just want to, kind of be as, as part of the school community as possible. They don't want to stick out in any way. They want to be, as involved with their peers as possible. They don't want to be sort of noticeable in any way. And I think it even said in the article that it had left some students open to bullying. And also for some students who maybe feel that actually, it's also a difficult one because, in terms of diagnosis and things like that, it's almost sort of saying, well, you are your diagnosis. You are kind of, we need to be kind of, this is who you are, because lanyards are labels. It's kind of, they're used to identify you. Certainly as teachers, when we went, yes, you're meant to be in this building. Yes, you are a teacher here. It's kind of, I find this whole approach completely baffling.
Absolutely baffling. Yeah. Just to take another tangent into this, Brent, this is clearly a troubled school. They had an inspection last January and they were rated inadequate, high levels of absence, and there's a line in the report. Some SEND students do not receive the support they need. It must raise questions about the quality and the nature of pastoral care and relationships in this school. I mean, today's Sunday. Should Ofsted not be back in there at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning trying to sort this out? I know that's not their job, but...
Yeah, I mean, all I can say in their defense is it might have been well-meaning, because there is more now where people are identifying needs, and you do see people sometimes with notices saying, I don't like loud noises. So there is that thing coming in where people are sort of are saying, this person doesn't like this certain things. Now, I don't have that issue with the majority of my students because I know them and I've taught them and I've read their passports and I've talked to their parents. But I get that in the school that I've been in that long, and I get that I've been in the profession that long. But this is what you get when you depersonalize education. This is what you get when you have a transient staff room. This is what you get when you have children whose needs are becoming more complex, is that the relationships are frayed. There isn't a relationship. So this is a child walks in, and what you're doing is you're just labeling it up just for that random stranger who's teaching that child, who might be a supply staff member or an inexperienced teacher or even an unqualified teacher. So what they're doing there is saying, we need some way to identify these children. So why don't we stick these labels on them so we know? It's a bit like food labeling, this X amount of salt and sugar. Okay, so there's the product we've got. And that's the problem. It's a depersonalization of education because it's become a business. And this is just a classic example of somebody who maybe male meanings thinking, we need some way to identify these kids. These kids aren't getting help. Right. Okay, the staff don't know, put a landlord on it. So that's really what it is. And that's exactly what, and I think there's a lot of other places doing similar things because they're overloaded with the amount of SEND they've got, and they're understaffed, and they're losing that expertise, and therefore they've made a massive error of judgment on that. But I think possibly there's a bigger issue going on with probably how the school has been run, managed, and how it's been over the last couple of years. That's my take on it.
Fair point. Absolutely. Yes. Fair point. Yeah. John, this is a mistake. I mean, Brent's hinting at it there. Okay, there may be reasons. It's problematic. Parents are up in arms. I think Brent's right. There are other schools that are in similar situations. They didn't make the Sun newspaper and so on, but nonetheless, they're doing similar things. How could a school that has made this error, how could it ever repair this? How can it get back to a better way of being?
That's a difficult one, because it is. on face value, not having visited the school or spoken to the people there, but on face value, this is a disaster of an idea. It's monumentally stupid. And as Lucy points out, what was the process? It's baffling to understand how good people, probably intelligent people, hopefully, came up with this. Their way out is to reject it, apologize, and humbly throw themselves on the mercy of people who have seen this and say, "What were we thinking? What else can you do when you do a thing like this?" But Brent's right to set the context of this. How do clever, hopefully again, people make such stupid decisions? And if you point to things that Brent pointed out, the kind of pressures that teachers are under, that out there in society, people with not particularly visible disabilities can sometimes be helped by having a sunflower card, lanyard, whatever, that they can show people. Yeah, I get that. But how this translated to school, I don't know.
Yeah. Although I would point out to you, John, that, somebody going around and putting an own identifier on themselves that they've decided to is very different from these children who have been forced and have been threatened with punishment if they're not wearing their lanyards and so on. And that makes it an altogether different, from wearing your blue badge that allows you to park in certain places. That's a completely different matter.
You're right. Paul, you're right. It's bonkers. It's a lovely example of the evil resulting from good intentions, whatever the road, the road to hell in good intentions. If you can forgive these people to some extent, if there was a shred of good intention there, it rapidly got lost in the nonsense. Over my career, I noticed that a lot of I may have been unlucky at the schools I taught at, whereas early meetings where teachers would be forthright in saying this was a stupid idea, and arguments took place. And towards the end of my career, I noticed people writing down management jargon or aphorisms that came out, and the quietness of meetings and the acceptance as teachers became increasingly quelled by workload, by neoliberalist ideas of managerial competition. We must get with the program and so on. We have a message in the school we must all abide to. I'm guessing that's where this stupidity came from.
I'll make one point. I was in the board of governors twice in my school. It no longer exists in multi-academy trusts, because that's something that you can imagine bringing that in front of parent governors. Could you imagine that went through the filter of staff and parent governors? That didn't go through any of the filtering of the community, because the community would have went, what are the parents? There is the problem of the decision making being almost pyramidical, driven down from the top, and without the context of the people in the area, not thinking about the consequences of it, and then saying, well, this is how we're going to do things here. And that's the same with uniform. It's the same with a lot of things happening in schools. They're losing the hearts and minds of communities because the communities are no longer engaged or involved. They've lost their schools. And they're starting to lose some of their humanity and their common sense as well, because those dissenting voices would have put their hand up and said, you really want to do this? You seriously really want to do this?
Yes.
And that's a failure, a monumental failure that I think is happening in a lot of other schools as well, not just with Lanyards, but many other aspects as well, with this top-down, dictatorial way that schools are managed now. It's just not working. It's not working for people. It's not working for staff. It's not working for kids.
But it goes back to that whole reflection on the wider society as well. Yes. And if that starts to become okay in schools, where else does it start to become okay?
Yes.
Well, if you tolerate this, then your children will be...
Recent history.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a good point, because schools and universities should be places where people can express dissent.
Yeah.
And you need to, and someone didn't in this school. Lots of teachers must have said, "Oh, this is a stupid idea," but went along with it.
Or forced to go along with it. Yes, you'd like to think there are very good people in that school, but for whatever reason or other, they didn't have their voice and their views heard. JBL reminds us that a lanyard is a method of ID and not a biography. Wisdom as ever from JBL. That's all we've time for on our third and final story this morning. On to reviews of the week after this. Now, last Friday, I listened to the Friday morning break with our very own panellist, John Gibbs. John and his guest, Dr. Neela Chowdhury, They explored the world of international education, and really, I think three big things struck me. Dr. Chowdhury said fits in with our stories this morning. Having something or someone that represents children's culture gives a strong sense of belonging. Love that line. I'm going to use that, definitely. I did pick up a strong sense of how driven and accountable international schools are, and particularly the private ones. That came across very, very strong. A lot of pressure, different pressure from the schools I taught in, but definitely a lot of pressure in those schools. Now, I have a particular interest in ethos and leadership, and I was really, really interested in that whole business of how she talked about her school instilling a sense of personal confidence and global perspective. And I was really interested to know, how was she able to inject that sense of ambition in those children to be played out on a global platform? A lot of children I taught over 40 years, they were very insular, they were very parochial. I really wanted to get that sense of ambition into them, to see themselves as much more than that little village they came from. But look, great show, John. Well done, thoroughly enjoyable. John, what about your own listening this week?
Well, I listened to, I was thinking that as we are restricted to little over half an hour, I listened to a 2.5 hour discussion with, I dipped in and out, by the way, but it was Tom's Late Show, and it was a discussion on the definitely a thorny issue of exclusions. Teachers are talking about exclusions are going up in schools, and straight up the debate was very clear between those teachers who who were presented with a dilemma, and the dilemma was, is there a certain level of behavior which is absolutely unacceptable? How do you protect teachers, and so on? And how do you explain the rise in exclusions? Are exclusions a disaster for society, or are they a necessity, and so on and so on? So there were various moments in the discussion when I was absolutely, what nonsense, and other times, oh yes, absolutely, I'm glad you said that. So it was a cracking piece of journalistic discussion.
Excellent. Great. Yeah. And love John making the case there for an extended weekly review.
Absolutely.
Lucy, what about you? What have you been listening to?
Well, kind of loosely sort of linked to the whole idea of protests and things like that, because certainly this is something that we have sadly lost in the wake of Brexit. And I have no problem saying I was, when all this came to light, I was out there on those marches. I can actually just see I've got my EU beret. I still wear my band, even though I live in continental Europe now. This was Christopher Val's show about Erasmus and what we've lost, which is something close to my heart as well. And he talked to, and I'm just going to list his names because they were wonderful, Dr. Charlotte Goddard, Daniela Leahy, and Sarah Gilikova, and Christine Lester. And they were talking all about how enriching, with their schools who've worked together, how students have visited different countries, the projects they did, particularly linked to environment. It's sad to think that maybe this is not going to be so much of a thing for children in the UK anymore, and it absolutely should be. And it's a fantastic listen, and I really enjoy Chris's style, and I think it's one to again, slightly longer one, but one to definitely dig into if you have time.
The erosion and loss of Erasmus is absolutely punishing for students here. John, I also learned from your show you spent a year in America. I didn't realize that.
Yes, I did a teaching.
2 years teaching in France. I mean, so enriching. Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Completely.
It was 30 odd years ago now, but I often refer to it. I'll say when I was in teaching in that high school, it's a very vivid year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Brent, what have you been listening to this week?
From Tokyo, actually, Will Mercer's debut show, which was a Saturday social, which was interesting. We can add Japan to our list of international contributors to Teachers Talk Radio. But he was talking to Jason Bentley, and something actually that was fashionable a couple of years ago, but seems to have gone out of fashion, is pupil voice and student advocacy. And it was all the rage about 7 or 8 years ago, and we used to do lots of surveys, but it seems to have died down a little bit. And I think that's sad, because I think we should be listening to the pupils. I think they are very clever and savvy about what they like obviously how they learn. And it was also talking about, pupil advocacy as well, because we sometimes say we want kids to take control of their learning, but then our lessons are becoming, and I want to speak from my own experience, becoming very prescriptive and very corporate. And I think that's the opposite of what, Jason was saying and Will was saying, because I think they've got the nail on the head of we need empowered young people who are into their learning and enjoying their learning and directing their learning rather than being directed. I think we're going back to the old style of teaching where chalk and talk in front of the classroom. And don't get me wrong, I can do that. But I think what they're suggesting is that all the science and everything is, especially in the world, they were looking at the future as well. The future is people being more in control and charge of their own destinies, as opposed to having somebody, direct them. You look at the rise of self-employment. So it was a really good listen. And I think it's a really good listen to remind us that we should listen to the pupils and give them more control over their learning, and then they may respond in kind. I think it was a definitely good listen. So that was a good debut from Will. That was the Saturday Social Show.
It was. I listened to that show. It was great, yeah. Well, that's us just recommending a sample of the vast number of shows that's available to everybody out there. We have a searchable database, and you can look for themes, topics, or indeed your favorite host. That's all we've time for this week. We do hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, let us know. Thank you to our sponsors, John Catt. Thank you very much to Lucy, Brent, and John. And we hope tomorrow isn't too much of a shock for you if you're back to school. But we'll see you again next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.
Oh, paddle marking.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.